Our top story, a Sky News exclusive on the crucial role the Gulf state of Qatar is playing in the hostage negotiations. A senior negotiator says all civilian hostages could be freed in days if Israel pauses its attacks.
Any escalation whatsoever is going to make our job really harder. Any escalation whatsoever. So we're trying to send those messages to our partners and friends.
It comes as Israel sends tanks and bulldozers into Gaza in the biggest raid of the conflict so far. And the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza says more than 7,000 people have now been killed in Israeli bombardments.
Also to come on the program, armed and dangerous. A major manhunt is underway in the U.S. state of Maine for the man responsible for America's deadliest mass shooting this year. The Conservative MP Crispin Blunt says he's been arrested on suspicion of rape, but he's confident he will not be charged. Walking the tech tightrope, Rishi Sunak makes a speech about the potential dangers of artificial intelligence, but stops short of suggesting how it can be regulated. Plus, the Beatles come together for one last time with the release of a new song brought about by the power of technology. And we're going to take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight.
Good evening from Jerusalem. Tonight, as the anxious wait goes on for families of over 200 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, it's clear that the role of Qatar is crucial. When 2 American hostages were freed last week, President Biden released a statement thanking the government of Qatar and the government of Israel for their partnership. When 2 elderly Israeli hostages were released on Monday, the Gulf state once again was involved. Qatar's senior negotiator has told Sky News he believes all civilian hostages can be released in the coming days, but only if there's a pause in the fighting. The Minister of State, Mohammed al-Khulaifi, has been speaking exclusively to Sky's international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn.
It is a world away from Gaza. Qatar's skyline troubled only by a rare autumn storm. But they are playing an outsized role here in the conflict by mediating the fate of its hostages.
It's a very, very difficult negotiation that we've been dealing with. And with this violence increases every day, with the bombing continuous every day, our task has become even more difficult.
Qatar was instrumental in the release of the only 4 hostages to be freed so far, an American mother and daughter and 2 elderly Israeli women. They're thought to be more than 200 left behind from 25 different countries.
Trying to deliver those messages.
Giving his only interview since the war began, Qatari negotiator Dr. Mohammed al-Khulaifi says there is now the opportunity to release many more.
Our target is to release all of the civilian hostages. That's what we're working on, and that's what we want to achieve. We're getting there. Every day we become more hopeful of the possibility of filling that gap and bringing the parties together. We remain hopeful. We do the best as we can, trying to get everyone's soon, and hopefully we can achieve that goal within the upcoming days.
Can you talk about the mechanics of the release of hostages and how much the bombing gets in the way of that? I mean, what is the problem there? Is it actually getting out to the hostages and getting them to safety?
I think it's mainly the difficulties for us to talk to the 2 sides. When an escalation happens and the killing of people over there, it's getting more difficult for us to talk logically to the people sitting there on the negotiating table.
There's a catch. For more hostages to come out, the violence must pause from both sides.
Is it fair to say if Israel goes in on the ground, it's going to make your job a lot harder?
Any escalation whatsoever is going to make our job really harder. Any escalation whatsoever. So we're trying to send those messages to our partners and friends. It's very important that everyone participate in this. Everyone should ask and seek a level where we could achieve even more out of this conflict.
There must be a reprieve in the fighting to let in more aid, they say. If not, Gaza's humanitarian situation could become catastrophic.
I think it's going to be disaster. I think it's going to be disaster. It's the situation over there is really horrible. The lack of water, food, medicine, fuel to generate the energy over there. It is not going to help sustaining the situation.
They are bracing themselves here and across the region for escalating conflict, but hoping for some kind of lull to let diplomacy still have a chance of working. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Doha, Qatar.
Well, Israel says it's carried out what it called a significant incursion into Gaza overnight using tanks and armoured bulldozers. The military said the targeted raid, the largest of the war so far, was to prepare the battleground for the next stage of the conflict. Across the enclave, the humanitarian crisis is getting worse, as our Middle East correspondent Alistair Bunkle reports.
In the early hours of this morning, the Israeli military conducted its biggest ground incursion into Gaza since this war began. Tanks and infantry soldiers went through the barrier fence in what Israel says was an operation to prepare the battlefield. They took out Hamas anti-tank positions and other infrastructure and then left. Sky News has geolocated the exact point where they entered along the northern section of the barrier.
The manoeuvre is only one stage in a long-term process that includes security, political and social aspects that will take years to complete. The campaign will soon ramp up with greater force.
By day, the Israeli bombing campaign continued. There have been more than 250 airstrikes in the last 24 hours. On the ground in Gaza, things are getting to breaking point. The UN says it desperately needs fuel to power its hospitals and water desalination plants. The Palestinian Health Ministry says that more than 7,000 Gazans have now died in the last 20 days. The Israeli bombing campaign has been the most intense of any country this century. Sawada Abu Uda's apartment was hit by an airstrike today. She lived there with her children and grandchildren. They're now homeless, and she has no idea why they were targeted.
They bombarded the building. Look at the bedroom where the children sleep. We didn't have any water from the day when the war started on the 7th of October. There is no running water. Check the cans. It's only a black slime coming out of the tap. We are all being penalised. We are civilians and did nothing wrong.
The United Nations held another emergency session in New York today, and both Israeli and Palestinian representatives addressed the chamber.
Should Hamas put down their arms, return our hostages and turn themselves in, this war will end without one more shot being fired.
Stop the bombs and save lives, as the President of the General Assembly has indicated. All lives of children, of civilians, of 2.3 million civilians.
There is a lot of international pressure on both sides to call a pause to the fighting. This would create a window to get more aid into Gaza, and it could be an opportunity for Hamas to release civilian hostages. If that happened, it would only be a temporary ceasefire, though. Israel hasn't achieved its objectives yet. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Israel.
Let's go back then to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. And Dominic, on the issue of the hostages, can you see the shape, the outline of a deal emerging here?
Mark, I think we can go as far as saying that the Qataris do sound surprisingly optimistic, and they are the ones to listen to. Both Hamas and Israel have both said that they regard the role they're playing in this conflict as absolutely crucial. And it's important to say that Dr. Mohammed al-Khulaifi does not really give interviews. His job is too delicate and sensitive in this conflict for him to talk to journalists much. So it's the first interview he's done since the war began. And I think he's chosen this moment to talk through Sky News to Israelis, but also to Israel's allies, to make the point that there is a window of opportunity here, he believes, but that window is narrowing with every hour that brings that, what is regarded as a rather inevitable Israeli ground offensive, closer. The reason he's sounding more optimistic is he says he and his team have learned from those 4 hostage releases, the 2 elderly Israeli women, the American mother and daughter. They've learned from that, and they say it's helped them come up with more creative and logical solutions to the problem of these hostages that they're putting to both parties. But the problem, he's saying, is that with the aerial bombardment continuing as ferociously as it is, that is making it hard to present and sell those ideas to Hamas, and it's making harder for Hamas as well to offer the ability to get out to those hostages and to bring them to places where they can be handed over. I think the problem for the Israelis is they need to work out whether that is for real or whether Hamas is actually just playing them via the Qataris. But the Qataris are certainly saying that there is this possibility, and if there is a pause in the fighting, may just be half a day or so, then there is the possibility of getting all of the civilian hostages out of Gaza.
OK, Dominic, thank you very much indeed. That is it from Jerusalem tonight. Let's go back to Barbara now in London.
Mark, thank you. Tonight, hundreds of police officers are hunting a gunman after a mass shooting that's left 18 people dead and more than a dozen injured in the U.S. state of Maine. Now, they're searching for a 40-year-old man thought to be an Army reservist. He's wanted in connection with the deadliest shooting in America this year. Well, let's take a quick look now at how this unfolded. Reports of the shootings began just before 7 o'clock last night at 2 locations in Lewiston. The first from a bowling alley, followed by calls from a restaurant about a 10-minute drive away. Lewiston, a city of about 38,000 people, is now on lockdown. Businesses have been told to close and people have been told to stay at home. There have been 565 mass shootings in the U.S. this year, and this one is the worst yet. Our U.S. correspondent Mark Stone reports.
A city in lockdown and a gunman on the run. There is an eerie quiet now in Lewiston, a day after such chaos and violence. Robert Card is the suspect, 40 years old, a former soldier, a firearms instructor, now wanted for mass murder. The images were taken at the start of a mass shooting that would begin at a community bowling alley and end at a nearby bar, with 18 people dead.
He should be considered armed and dangerous. Based on our investigation, we believe this is someone that should not be approached.
In the car park of Shemengi's Bar and Grill, yellow tape marks out a crime scene, one from where they have been removing the victims. 8 people died here. Among them, the bar manager, Joseph Walker.
He died as a hero because he picked up a butcher knife from somewhere, you know, he has all that stuff near the bar anyways. And he tried to go at the gunman to stop him from shooting anybody else. The gunman shot him twice through the stomach.
Extra resources are now being drawn into the county for a manhunt that stretches across the state. A key question is how he is moving around. His car was recovered, but the river has been a focus too, with the Coast Guard now involved.
Not quite sure what to feel. Sad, devastated, broken.
Melissa Holmes lives around the corner from the bowling alley. Her children play there often. Fate placed her just out of harm's way when the shooting began.
I left my house to go pick up my daughter from cheering, which was about 500 yards to the left of that building. You know, like it hits in the pit of your stomach. Like it really shows the gravity of what's going on.
Beyond the obvious urgency to find the gunman, there is such a depressing familiarity about all this. The pain of another community, the intense media focus for a time, and then, of course, the questions. Why, again, in America? The weapon is an assault-style rifle. Here in Maine, it's legal to own. But Card is known to have had mental health issues, and military commanders reported his erratic behavior in July. And so again, America's relationship with guns is the focus, and here, in the middle of a manhunt.
Well, let's speak to our U.S. correspondent Mark Stone, who is live for us in Lewiston. So, Mark, are they any closer to finding the gunman?
Well, there is tonight quite an interesting degree of police activity about 20 or so miles to the southeast of where we are, an area where we believe he grew up. and where he lived. Now, a little earlier on today, the police were searching a property that was linked to his family, and now there is some police activity in a couple of locations, as I say, to the southeast of here. But the whole area remains under a lockdown at the moment, with shops shut, schools shut, and everyone being told to remain at home because police are extremely concerned. And of course, all of this fear is obviously compounding grief, which is felt so strongly across this really very small community, another American community coming to terms with another American mass shooting.
Mark Stone with the latest there from Lewiston. Mark, thank you. The Conservative MP Crispin Blunt has confirmed that he's been arrested on suspicion of rape and possession of controlled substances. Mr. Blunt posted a statement on social media earlier today after Surrey police confirmed they'd made an arrest and released a man on bail. He says he is confident he will not be charged. Well, joining us live for more on this is our political correspondent, Amanda Akas. Amanda, good to see you. What more do we know about this case?
Well, earlier this evening, Crispin Blunt publicly identified himself as the subject of media reports that a Conservative MP had been arrested on suspicion of rape and possession of a controlled substance yesterday morning. In a statement on social media, he said, "I've now been interviewed twice in connection with this incident. The first time 3 weeks ago when I initially reported my concern over extortion. The second time was earlier this morning under caution following arrest. The arrest was unnecessary as I remain ready to cooperate fully with the investigation that I'm confident will end without charge. I do not intend to say anything further on this matter until the police have completed their inquiries." Now, Crispin Blunt, he's 63 years old. He's been the MP for Reigate for more than 25 years, and he's a pretty well-known figure. He was chair of the influential Foreign Affairs Select Committee for a few years and also previously served as a Justice Minister with responsibility for prisons and probation. Now, he'd already announced his intention to stand down at the next general election, but tonight the Conservative Party say they've suspended the whip from him pending the outcome of the police investigation. Effectively means he'll be an independent MP, although he's also been asked to stay away from Parliament. And for the Conservatives, this really tops a very difficult period. They're still reeling from that double by-election defeat last week. Yesterday, they had the suspension of former Tory Minister Peter Bone under allegations of bullying and sexual misconduct. Today, the Prime Minister was really hoping to wrest back control of the narrative with a big speech on AI. Instead, the political focus once again is on serious allegations against one of his own MPs.
Amanda Akas with the latest there from Westminster. Amanda, thank you. Now, some believe that AI will transform our lives for the better, while others are worried it could threaten humanity's existence altogether. Well, today the Prime Minister announced the creation of an Artificial Intelligence Safety Institute. Rishi Sunak said people should have peace of mind that the government is developing protection around the AI, but he wouldn't say when regulations would be introduced. Here's our science and technology editor, Tom Clark.
The Prime Minister makes no secret of the fact he's a fan of AI. His vision for the future, technologies like this at Moorfields Eye Hospital, where an AI can diagnose not just blindness but other life-threatening conditions. But the purpose of today was about AI's risks.
These reports provide a stark warning. Get this wrong, and AI could make it easier to build chemical or biological weapons. Terrorist groups could use AI to spread fear and destruction on an even greater scale. Criminals could exploit AI for cyber attacks, disinformation, fraud, or even child sexual abuse. And in the most unlikely but extreme cases, there is even the risk that humanity could lose control of AI completely.
The AI Safety Summit he's convening next week is meant to build consensus between big tech and other governments on minimising those risks, while allowing society to reap AI's benefits. A deep-fake AI that can revert a balding 50-year-old TV reporter to imagined college yearbook-style photos isn't exactly dangerous. But manipulating a speech or faking events that never happened, like the arrest of Donald Trump, certainly could be. New tools and existing regulators could manage those kind of harms. The real problem, warns London-based AI firm Conjecture, are ultra-powerful AIs like ChatGPT and its rivals. Its boss is one of the select few attending next week's summit.
There's maybe 3 to 4 companies in the world that can build them. And the bigger these machines are, the more intelligent and existentially dangerous these AI systems become. There is simply no solution that will lead to a safe future for humanity that does not involve inconveniencing big tech. And inconveniencing big tech is very dangerous for politicians. They have a lot of lobbyists and a lot of power and a lot of money.
Will you compel big tech companies to make the code of their models available?
These are all the types of conversations that we need to have with the companies, and that's why it's so important at the summit next week. We're involving not just countries, but we're involving all the leading AI companies and researchers and policy experts to have those conversations.
Having a conversation isn't exactly tough talk, but the PM has chosen to walk a tech tightrope. As campaigners warn of the risks, he wants to establish the UK as a leader in AI regulation, while trying to ensure Silicon Valley doesn't snatch away the keys to the future. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Sky News understands criminals are abusing the visa system that was designed to allow carers to be recruited from abroad, resulting in constant allegations of fraud and modern slavery. The concerns have led to a nationwide investigation into care agencies operating illegally, as our communities correspondent Becky Johnson now reports.
They provide a lifeline for vulnerable people, and a shortage of carers in Britain means staff are needed from abroad. But Sky News can reveal widespread visa fraud and a nationwide investigation into modern slavery in the care sector. In northwest England, we found migrants knocking on care home doors, desperate for a job.
We are looking for a work permit, like most of the care homes giving work permit or jobs.
Inside, staff didn't want to be identified, but told us they're constantly being contacted by companies they've never heard of, offering them carers.
We probably get about 4 or 5 calls a day asking if we need any agency staff. And a lot are now are phoning and offering that they'll do a free shift.
And in terms of the knocks on the door from people asking for work, how often is that?
2 or 3 times a day, I'd say.
It's happening because some companies are illegally charging for work visas and then failing to provide jobs. This woman, who we're calling Mary, paid £4,000 to an agent in the north of England for a certificate of sponsorship for a full-time job as a carer. It was only after she arrived from the Philippines in July that she realised she'd been conned.
Have they given you any work? No. Even single day of work, they couldn't provide, they didn't give us.
Visa rules mean she's only allowed to work full-time for her sponsor, and any part-time work has to also be in care. So like the people we saw knocking on doors, she's also been approaching care homes.
Do you feel trapped?
Yeah.
Could you go back?
No, I couldn't. I spend a lot of money and my family doesn't know my situation here and I don't want to tell them. They will be upset.
She's scared of the consequences of reporting her sponsor, which is why we're not naming the company. But it's one of several apparently fake agencies set up since February 2022, when the government began allowing carers in on skilled worker visas.
So I think it's very, very close to people trafficking.
This care home owner in Milton Keynes had to pause overseas recruitment after finding out an agent he'd paid had also illegally charged a worker for her visa.
What sort of sums of money are we talking about?
So the recruiter's getting £30,000 to bring somebody over. So actually, it's probably more than the transporters are getting for the rubber dinghies coming across the channel.
A major investigation is now underway into multiple care agencies suspected of being established with the intention of exploiting workers.
The sole purpose of these criminals is to use these people as cash cows. They are running businesses at a much reduced cost because they're not paying them what they're supposed to. It is our #1 priority at the moment.
The government insists companies operating unlawfully may face prosecution and removal from the sponsorship register. Many in the care sector believe urgent reform is needed to protect workers and the vulnerable people they look after. Becky Johnson, Sky News.
More than 60 years after Beatlemania, a long-awaited final song featuring all 4 members of the band is to be released. Now and Then was written and sung by John Lennon in the late 1970s at his home in New York City. Now, thanks to AI technology, it's been possible to enhance the audio and bring the song to new and faithful fans. Here's our arts and entertainment correspondent, Katie Spencer.
When we lost John, we knew that it was really over.
I was talking to Yoko, and she said, I think I've got a tape of John.
The words of the band's late guitarist George Harrison, a tantalising tease for fans, explaining how actually back in 1994 the remaining Beatles received the song they're now about to release. The new material was recorded by John Lennon at his New York home in the late 70s. And while they put out tracks like Free as a Bird in the mid-90s, limitations of technology at the time meant Paul, George and Ringo struggled to make Now and Then work, so they left it. Crucially, though, George did try out some guitar parts. Fast forward almost 30 years to filmmaker Peter Jackson's groundbreaking documentary on the band, crammed full of old archive material, and he and his team actually developed new software, which meant they could separate out Lennon's vocals from his piano playing. Armed with that and George's guitar efforts, Sir Paul and Sir Ringo were able to go back into a recording studio. And, well, we'll hear the results next week.
Paul called me up and said he'd like to work on Now and Then. He put the bass on, I put the drums on.
It's the last song that my dad and Paul and George and Ringo will get to make together.
How lucky was I to have those men in my life?
To say this is a musical moment is an understatement.
I think it's wonderful that they can bring the music that they recorded back then into the modern age and it still be relevant.
Not only is there a new song, there's also a 12-minute documentary on the way explaining just how the band managed to make this. Will it have come together in a way that pleases fans? We'll find out when the Beatles' final ever song is released next week. Katie Spencer, Sky News.
And that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's papers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by the journalist and author Ian Dunt and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. Among the stories we'll be discussing, this story on the front of The Guardian. Their headline, Israel stages raid into Gaza as new phase of war begins. We'll be right back. This is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. First, though, our top stories. A senior negotiator in Qatar has told Sky News all civilian hostages could be freed in days if Israel pauses its attacks. A major manhunt is underway in the U.S. state of Maine for the man responsible for America's deadliest mass shooting this year. And the Conservative MP Crispin Blunt says he's been arrested on suspicion of rape, but he is confident he will not be charged. Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what is making the headlines with the journalist and author Ian Dunt and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, The Guardian's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war focuses on the Israeli raid into Gaza, declaring a new phase of the conflict has started. 200 Britons trapped in Gaza plead for help is the headline of The Times, adding the Prime Minister has promised to do everything possible as border force officials are sent to Egypt. The Telegraph's take on the war, the invitation by Russian President Vladimir Putin for Hamas and Iranian leaders to visit Moscow. And The Eye reports on the arrest of Conservative MP Crispin Blunt on suspicion of rape and possession of controlled substances. The Sun leading with that story as well, with the headline, MP in rape and drugs arrest. Reporting on Rishi Sunak's belief that artificial intelligence poses a threat to humanity, the Metro has the headline, End of the World is AI. And the front page of The Express reports on hope for treatment for dementia, with cases in the UK set to soar in coming years. But the FT has happier news involving the US economy, which has seen a 4.9% increase to its gross domestic product. And finally, the Daily Star's front page, which suggests, quote, grumpy folk are not just having a bad day, they may be suffering a demonic possession. Well, and a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the program, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us. And we are joined today by Ian Dunt and Salma Shah. So thank you both for joining us. Unsurprisingly, the Middle East still dominates many of the headlines. So Salma, what stood out for you in the coverage, looking at The Guardian specifically?
So The Guardian, as you mentioned in your summary, has talked about Israeli forces entering a new phase with their raid into Gaza, which they've described as substantial but limited. And this really is changing the pace, I think, of the conflict. You see as well, throughout The Guardian's copy and in other newspapers, calls of potentially the EU leaders asking for humanitarian corridors and a pause, and also questions coming into the US President Joe Biden about what he said to Benjamin Netanyahu about his support and how far that extends if they do decide to go into this ground invasion that everybody is expecting. So lots of movement strategically and politically.
And Ian, as we were mentioning, of course, everyone has been waiting for this ground invasion. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu said as much just yesterday night. But it has been nearly 3 weeks now since the massacre of October 7th. Do you get the sense that public opinion, either in the UK or governments, are slightly shifting their stance on a possible ground invasion?
Public opinion in the UK, I mean, things are quite volatile and highly changeable at the moment. But, I mean, seems quite wary of what is going on, and I think instinctively would be that way. Governments, primarily, the main change that we've seen is this real kind of rallying around the idea of a ceasefire. We've also seen commensurate pressure then on Labour leader Keir Starmer in a manner that you would expect, predominantly from the left of his party, but not exclusively from the left of his party, centrist Labour MPs as well. I find it a bit... there's a sort of certain element to that that's sort of baffling, because you sort of think, like, well, there has to be a counter-offer. If that's going to be a serious proposal to Israel, there has to be a counter-offer that says, OK, fine, ceasefire. But you also have to explain how Israel is going to get the thing that it needs, which is to make sure that Hamas cannot do this again. You know, there cannot just be this thing of like, you stop now, there's no more to talk about. So therefore, the conversation which actually Labour and the government are much closer to, which is, well, there can be temporary cessations, and, you know, we can make sure we get humanitarian aid in there, and then we'll see what happens once the cessation is there. That seems a more realistic conversation to have.
I think the interesting thing about this conversation is, you know, Keir Starmer is being asked to take a position, but the leader of the opposition, indeed the British Prime Minister, is not actually able to shift the dial on this. The most critical thing right now, from Israel's perspective, is to bring those hostages back. And indeed, it is for other world leaders, Britain's included, are part of that hostage group. And they are going to be in Gaza. So this is a very complex situation where you are trying to extract a huge number of people with severe conditions who are essentially being used as leverage. I mean, you'll see in the coverage as well in The Guardian that Iran is talking about potentially acting as a mediator between the hostages at the moment as well. So it is incredibly complex. And even though there's a lot of pressure being put on the Labour leader to talk about a ceasefire, ultimately, you know, he has no power to do it, and nor can anyone act unilaterally.
It's spot on. There's a sort of parochial sense to the British debate, which is, you know, this like, well, we'll just talk about our stuff, because we know that Britain has no influence in this matter. You know, Israel doesn't really care about what any other country says, apart from the US, if anyone at all.
Except there is now a lot of attention on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is the focus of the Times. I think page 6 and 7, the headline here, Israel accused of weaponizing hunger as food stocks dwindle. Ian.
Yeah, so these are aid agencies with some really quite robust rhetoric, as you've just outlined, about what's going on in Gaza. The report is really strong, and I mean, the report is actually looking in quite minute detail, for instance, about what is it like to be a Gazan just trying to get bread. You know, lots of bakeries have now been bombed. What is the process of trying to get food for your family? 5-hour waits, that sense of danger and exposure and vulnerability during that moment. And I think as well, by looking at those words, weaponizing hunger, you get a sense of how acute the rhetoric and the emotional sort of fragility is around this issue, and how intense it could be over the next few weeks and, unfortunately, months.
Because they really are running out of everything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a quote here that really stuck out to me from Riham Jafari, who's from Action Aid in Palestine, who says, "Those who survive the bombings may die from starvation instead." And I think this is, you know, this is war. These are going to be difficult tactics. Hamas does embed itself within the civilian population. And I think we're going to see some very shocking, very harrowing, continued shocking and harrowing pictures coming out of Gaza.
OK. Slightly move away from the story in the Middle East, focusing on something here in the UK. And Rishi Sunak here, front page of the Metro, end of the world is AI. So, you know, you're an AI optimist or a pessimist?
Neither. I can't.
You can care less.
No, I can't work out what they're talking about. And it seems that he is talking in exactly the same way as everybody else when they pop on the radio or the TV. They sort of come on and they're like, everything's going to get easier, we're going to make loads more money, and also possibly everyone's going to die.
Yeah.
No, we might all die, but also, you know, jobs will be easier, and, you know, something's going to happen to paralegals now. You know, the computer's going to do it instead. And the document that was put out by the government is a bit more beefy and substantial and interesting. Sunak's speech itself is just that again. It's just like, oh, by the way, lots of good stuff, maybe complete, you know, existential catastrophe, but also maybe good stuff. And I sort of think, I don't really know. I read the speech and just thought I honestly felt quite a lot stupider than I was.
So you don't go on ChatGPT and put random questions in to see what comes up?
I did it once and I felt very, very lonely.
What did you ask?
I asked a series of questions as to what I should do on my holiday. Why am I letting the machine dictate for me what happens to me in Barcelona?
Okay, fair enough. Salma.
So I have to say, I think this is very interesting for two reasons. One, it is a huge global issue, and he is saying all the right things in terms of trying to understand how one future-proofs against this kind of technology, because he rightly says, you know, you could end up with making it easier to build chemical or biological weapons. There are some serious implications. We're not there right now. Yeah. But what is actually really strange about this, a year out from an election cycle, is that none of this has any electoral salience. So it's very interesting to have a Prime Minister who is such a policy wonk. I mean, he's very clever. Nobody ever denies this. But thinking about it in terms of being potentially a year out from an election, let's see.
Very clever is the most generous thing I've ever heard anyone say about Rishi Sunak.
He's very clever. But a lot of people do fear they're going to lose their jobs to AI. So wouldn't that have some political clout?
Except until they realise it, ChatGPT is sort of a little bit of fun for most people. And I've never used it, but people who have tell me that it's amazing and it's brilliant and it does all these great things. Okay. But when you're looking at, a difficult economic situation, when you're looking at public services not performing as well as they should be, if you've got the Prime Minister making a big speech about AI, it feels slightly incongruous, I think, with where the rest of the country is at the moment.
Okay. You don't think it's a good idea to at least raise the profile? Because in fairness, none of us seem to be experts on it and we don't use it very much. But, it does seem to be one of the big game changers coming up.
It absolutely is. I think the Prime Minister has to be realistic about how much Britain can drive it themselves. So until we see big US presence coming in to talk about AI regulation and tech regulation, because let's not forget, the people who are most advanced on this are American companies in terms of, the Googles of the world. We're actually going to struggle to sort of really make the headway if we're thinking about how we governance this and how we create that set of global regulation that's going to actually have any impact on how this technology evolves.
Yeah, I don't know what he's doing. I just don't... I mean, this is the kind of thing that you would say, right, so this speech would be made by one of the Secretaries of State. Your point, I think, is exactly sound. It's like, why would he wrap himself in it? When really what is demanded of him is what is going on with NHS waiting time.
Because he knows about this stuff probably better than, a lot of people. He wants to talk about it. He cares about it. And it's not a bad thing to talk about. It's actually in 50 years' time...
And there's a summit next week about it as well.
Exactly. He's hosting this summit next week. He's got a couple of world leaders coming to it, so that's, a start. But in 50 years' time, when this technology is really out there, we're going to be so glad that Rishi Sunak cared about this at this point. It doesn't make sense to us right now, but in 50 years' time, this will all make sense.
I'm not certain that's true.
We'll settle it in 50 years' time. Let's look at the FT now. And the front page there, Shadow Chancellor red-faced as book shows copy lifted from other sources. Ian.
Welcome to, the anxiety nightmare of anyone that has ever written a book. So you just look at the stuff and you're like, you feel the shiver go down you. And weirdly, the story is... OK, one thing to speak about is why, in the name of God, are so many politicians writing books? Yeah. They should not have time to be writing these books. I don't think, when the London mayor... These are all politicians I like, by the way. I'm just like, you're supposed to be running the city. Yeah. There shouldn't be time for this. She is the shadow chancellor. I don't see how this time... And evidently, the truth is, she didn't have time and therefore just started copying and pasting from Wikipedia, which I can confirm, as an author, is generally frowned upon. The plagiarism worries me less than the kind of shoddy quality of the research. Because if you're in any position that you were using Wikipedia for your book, that is a really problematic statement to have made.
But it's not just Wikipedia. It's that she didn't basically give credit to some of the people in research that she used. Isn't that right?
Yes, but she's focused most of her attention on the fact that she's taking responsibility for the errors and the plagiarism that's in there. I do think Ian's right that, this sort of profile gathering thing that politicians do in order to kind of make themselves look a little bit more serious by writing books is a little bit silly when she's got so much going on. But I think Rachel Reeves has done such a brilliant job as Shadow Chancellor to sort of talk about Labour as a serious party for business. She's slightly damaged herself a little bit here because, it doesn't seem like she's, all as together as we might have presumed she was.
And we shouldn't exaggerate, by the way. The Tories are trying to make a really severe attack on this, and that is not going to work. No one is going to care, and it's not going to damage Labour's prospects or anything like that. But actually, she has come out of this worse than she went into it.
OK, we're going to look at more of tomorrow's papers in just a few minutes. For the moment, Ian and Salma, thank you. Now, should Rishi Sunak or Sir Keir Starmer be taking a leaf out of Joe Biden's book when it comes to fiscal policy? We'll discuss that in the FT next.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors. I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it. Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone, I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Ian Dunt and Salma Shah. Thank you both for being with us. Okay, let's take a look at the Financial Times. Another story from here, their top story really. Resilient consumer spending spurs U.S. economy to 4.9% GDP growth. So good news for the U.S. economy. Could Bidenomics work here, Salma?
Well, this is something that the Labour Party is definitely talking about, and Rachel Reeves has done a very good job of saying that this is going to be Labour's economic plan. And this is obviously grist to that mill, because we're talking about consumer confidence coming back, the Fed thinking about not having to raise interest rates further. So it does look good. But of course, there are going to be, I mean, lots of economists will be shouting at the TV at the moment, sort of talking about the differences between our economies and whether that is still possible here because of the differences in capital that's being circulated around in the UK, consumer confidence and investment. So I think it's going to require a bit more detail from the Shadow Chancellor if we are going to import Bidenomics, as it were.
Well, as a Brit, you look at these numbers and you're like, it's like looking at some other world. You know, you just like, this is just the most preposterous thing. The funny thing is, you look at the polling in the US, and there's really persistent polling that shows people were very unhappy with Biden for his handling of the economy. And you just think, what else could you possibly want from the president but what he's handed you here? I mean, the core difference really is the fact that Britain is going to struggle to borrow the kind of money that the Americans find very easy to borrow, basically because of their currency, but also because of the state of our political debate, because, you know, essentially Rachel Reeves has had to kind of put a straitjacket around herself with her own fiscal rules. But it is quite noticeable that, you know, if like me, you grew up in the sort of New Labour, Tony Blair, kind of Bill Clinton era, where there was this real aversion to any kind of state intervention in the market. That was considered old hat, 1970s militant trade unionism. That's the language Biden talks. We intervene in the economy. It's proper old-school Keynesianism, really, and it speaks the language of the multiplier, of actually working the economy that way. And that is the kind of language that if you scratch away at some of the more austerity rhetoric around Labour, when you look at the policies, especially on net zero, that's the kind of stuff you see from Labour as well.
OK, but I'm just going to point out to you that one of the criticisms of several Conservative administrations is exactly that they haven't actually they've been too interventionist and they haven't allowed the market to really thrive in this situation. I think there are a lot of people who would criticise, certainly post-pandemic, you know, just how much state intervention, how much propping up was done, you know, the levelling up agenda, what George Osborne was doing in advance of that. So, you know, have we already had our version of Bidenomics and it hasn't worked all that well?
I think the other way of looking at that is look at the space that the Conservatives offered Labour on that old issue of the market versus the state by talking about Brexit, by talking about state aid, by talking about levelling up. And suddenly, you know, a centre-left party can go like, OK, so you just opened up that space. Now we can move over here quite significantly. I think we've all probably underestimated the kind of ideological effect of COVID, of seeing the only way we could get through this is the state intervening. Now Labour is going to try and capitalise.
It'd be interesting to see if and how this would impact the US elections, which of course are coming up next year. And it could segue into a story in the Metro, page 16. Trump flouts gag order again. Trump storms out of fraud trial as he's fined for breaching gag order. Ian.
Yes, it won't surprise you to learn that Donald Trump is storming out of court cases where he's pretty much banged to rights, saying they're all partisan against him, not abiding by the rules that have been set down. I mean, you can sort of write the script yourself for the way that this man behaves at this stage, and he reliably does continue to be the worst possible version of himself.
What's very fascinating about this is that he's talking about habitually exaggerating the value of his assets. And so this is something that's always been... Ian's going to make me laugh now. But this is very interesting because it is about sort of the image that he created for himself as this very successful billionaire. And it's sort of, you know, tarnishing slightly that image. I do think it's very on brand for Donald Trump to flout a court order and, you know, pay a fine for it. So I never quite know if it's something that he's intending to do because it riles the base up or whether it's just somebody who's being very erratic.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, you know, his base, according to many of them, he can do no wrong. Either they're not going to believe it or it's not really going to have an impact on the election. I mean, it's quite interesting seeing at everything that's going on in the Middle East right now, you know. We think it's bad, but then sometimes you think, gosh, if Donald Trump was president of the United States, I guess the situation might prove even maybe more unstable, but certainly maybe a lot of European leaders would feel less confident in a US led by Trump.
Yeah, I think the issue here is that there's a complexity in foreign affairs that we sort of depend on the US to lead us on. You know, it's the previous conversation we had, is that, you know, Biden says something, Israel will listen, not necessarily true for everybody else. But what is fascinating is that you never really know with Trump where you sit, because he was trying to ally himself with President Putin, who has been hosting a delegation with Hamas members in it, you know, just this week. And so, you know, the knock-on effects down on various different policy and geopolitical events is going to be a lot more confusing, I think.
We're going to have to leave it there for now. We will, of course, look at more of tomorrow's stories in the 11 o'clock. For now, Salma Shah, Ian Dunt, thank you. And now let's take a look at the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
There'll be widespread showers or longer spells of rain through the weekend and strong winds in the north and south. It'll be mostly mild at first tomorrow, with prolonged rain over eastern Scotland, showers near exposed southern and western coasts, and inland fog. Most parts will see a mix of sunny spells and locally heavy showers through the morning, but fog will be slow to lift, while eastern Scotland will see more rain. Northern and central parts of Ireland may well stay dry. It will be quite mild again for most, cooler where fog lingers, but it'll be windy in the north and the far south. The afternoon will bring little overall change.
The weather, sponsored